On 18th of September, the question is indeed, should Scotland be an independent country? I think, away from the technical nature of the question, for each of us, that translates into what is better for my family, my community, for the country as a whole. And that's incredibly personal. And it involves issues of both the heart and the head, which I'm sure we'll examine over the course of the next couple of hours. It's not like a general election, this decision. This isn't one that can be changed a few years after the event. And for those who wish Scotland to be independent, quite right too, they'll say this is irreversible. This is a choice that we make that will change things out of all recognition to what we have today. And for that reason, I would argue that it is one of the, makes it some of the most fundamental issues facing us at any time. Throws them into very sharp focus about the economy, our place in the world, and our relations with the rest of the United Kingdom. For all of us, I think it starts with our identity, and for many people here, I'm sure they'll have a complicated background like I have too, although many more complicated backgrounds. I happen to be born in Northern Ireland, but I've lived in Scotland, brought up in Scotland, lived here most of my life, and most of it here in this beautiful part of the world. I'm proud to be a borderer, I'm proud to be Scottish, but I'm also proud to be British. I think that in this part of the country, we probably know more about identity than most, some of it forged by centuries of conflict and tussles with our neighbours just a few miles from here. But to this day, all our families, our businesses, our ways of life are very closely meshed together. And what's true for us is, I would argue, true for the country as a whole. Across these islands, 450,000 people or thereabouts from elsewhere in the United Kingdom live here in Scotland, and 800,000 people who regard themselves as Scottish live elsewhere in the UK. We are, to that extent, a family of nations. We have very distinctive histories. We have very clear differences in defining moments, whether it's Bannockburn or Agincourt. But in more recent times, there have been the shared sacrifices at Dunkirk or the Somme. In literature, culture, and in sport, it all comes together through Burns or Shakespeare, as well as the BBC. The Commonwealth Games will celebrate in Glasgow in a few weeks' time, and the Olympics. We are, seems to me, very well suited to working and living together in terms of our cultural background. But each person's take on their identity and where they're from and what that means to them influences the way we want to look at the world and the way we want to shape it. That really depends on your outlook on life, and for me as a Liberal, I want decisions to be taken as close to the people affected as makes sense. But alongside that, which is a powerful argument for devolution, I believe that in a fast-changing world where the challenges are getting ever bigger and beyond the ability of any one single country to tackle, it makes sense to work with others to take on those global problems. My proposition, and you'll have heard this argued by others across the country, is that within the United Kingdom we have the best of both worlds. A strong Scottish Parliament, as well as a strong voice at Westminster. Key decisions are taken close to home in Scotland's own Parliament, being strengthened by the tax and borrowing powers from the Scotland Act of 2012, with income tax coming online in 2016. And let's not lose sight of the fact that devolution allows us to act alone in critical areas like our health service, completely independent of the rest of the United Kingdom. The devolution settlement has evolved so that it made sense. People realised that transferring the powers over the railways shouldn't remain in Whitehall, it should be here in Scotland. So those were devolved a number of years ago. It's also a flexible settlement. It allows us to work with the rest of the UK even when the matter is very firmly devolved, as indeed one can argue was before the Act of Union. We have separate legal systems, always have had, and always through the period of the Union, that continued. What has allowed us to do, however, is when we need to, as we do in terms of proceeds of crime legislation, we can quite straightforwardly work together so that any criminal act committed in Scotland, but the proceeds of the criminal act hidden in England or Wales, all that is available to the Scottish authorities as they wish, and vice versa. If you're in England and commit the crime and then flee to Scotland, you haven't got beyond the arm of the law. Close, practical arrangements that are for all our benefit. Another aspect of it, that I would argue, is that it is a very flexible system. And the Edinburgh Agreement, I would argue, is a good example of that. Sensible, rational decision taken to recognise the fact that while the constitutional power to hold the referendum firmly rested with Westminster, Scotland was where the decision should be taken. This had to be made in Scotland, and the power appropriately devolved. And through the Edinburgh Agreement and the Section 30 order, we were able to do that so that Jim and his colleagues were responsible for the legislation here in Scotland rather than Westminster MPs. So, Scotland and the rest of the UK can work flexibly and in partnership with each other under devolution. But independence will be the end of that approach. Of course, we would still, I hope, work well together as neighbouring states. But instead of the flexibility that is part of devolution, the responsiveness of that, we would have formal negotiations and the strictures that go with that. And instead of what I would argue is common purpose, increasingly we would have parallel arrangements. In contrast, staying part of the United Kingdom, but enhancing the power of the Scottish Parliament, allows us to take the journey in self-determination as far as is appropriate and we feel comfortable about. Let me, if I may, turn to one or two of the fairly fundamental arguments that are at the heart of our decision. One of those is about, of course, the economy. My basic idea and argument here is that through being part of the United Kingdom, we have greater opportunity and also greater resilience than we might enjoy on our own. Scotland is the third wealthiest part of the UK after London and the southeast of England. But when things have been tougher in recent years, the broad tax base of the whole of the United Kingdom has been able, in relative terms, to protect the stability of the public finances that are so critical to our public health service, our local government and the like. Still tough, but compared to others elsewhere in Europe as independent states, not as difficult as it might have been. In Scotland, as 5 million people, we access a market of 60 million consumers and businesses south of the border. Whether you're at Churnside, at Alstrom, along the road at Greenvale, here in Duns at Farnham Salmon, most of these businesses, if not all of them, are heavily dependent on the demand that comes from elsewhere in the United Kingdom. We enjoy a common currency, common business taxes, common employment rules and regulation, which enable businesses to invest and trade with one another across the whole of the United Kingdom with the minimum of hassle and fuss. And when we're looking at jobs and prosperity, reducing the burdens on business and like, I think is a hugely important feature of what we enjoy within the UK. I'd also suggest to you that the sharing of the costs of our infrastructures across the UK is hugely different when we've got 60-odd million people sharing those costs rather than just a few million of us here in Scotland. the universal service obligation placed on the Royal Mail to deliver mail at the same cost and on the same time scale anywhere in the United Kingdom is a hugely costly arrangement, but shared across the whole of the United Kingdom, that is affordable, although inevitably, from time to time, one that people want to ask questions about. I think it's a lot easier when you look at the rurality of Scotland. We know all about it here in the borders, but think of the Highlands and the Islands as well. To have that USO is just one example of this, shared across the whole of the UK rather than just by us. But turn it around and look abroad. When we're promoting Scottish business internationally, we are able to access 170 countries where UKTI has 270 different offices. In addition, Scottish Development International, part of the Scottish Government, has a presence in 15 countries, able to focus its efforts on the shoulders and on the back of what we're doing for the UK as a whole. So being part of something bigger helps us to reduce cost, and it also spurs innovation, and it allows more consumer choice as well. When things are tougher, it also helps with resilience. And if you think back just a few short years to the crisis with our banks, we had a huge difference that across the country, it was the whole of the United Kingdom that was able to underpin and bail out RBS and Bank of Scotland, not just us here in Scotland. We'll come on to other arguments shortly, I'm sure. But I want to make one last point about our place in the world. I think it matters to us to be part of the UK and to promote ourselves as widely, as broadly as we do. But as part of the UK, we're also at the top table in the European Union, in the G7, and in NATO. We're the permanent members on the United Nations Security Council. I think that helps us in Scotland with our place in an ever more challenging world.
Thank you very much.